The Legend of Zelda series, known for its debated timeline, groundbreaking game mechanics, epic storytelling, and hand-holding you'll fall in love with. But today we're going to discuss its meat and potatoes, the dungeons. Before I start my list, I want to point out that I'll be focusing on the 3D Zelda games since there are a few 2D titles I still need to play. Also, I won't be including boss battles, but instead centering my focus on enemies, atmosphere, dungeon theme, dungeon aesthetic, and the puzzles. With that out of the way, here's my number 5. From the first game in the Zelda timeline, Skyward Sword. I feel the game's final dungeon is looked over by many fans. Most people seem to gravitate towards the ancient Cistern or the Sandship. But my favorite dungeon from Skyward Sword is Skykeep. It's such a unique Zelda dungeon since the entire interior is one big puzzle. In order to proceed, you have to line up the rooms so that the doors connect. Each individual room is based off of a previous dungeon. Same with the theme, to remind you of the places that you've already visited. Story-wise, this place is located on Skyloft. I'd guess the goddess Hylia created this trial when she escorted people to the sky. She must have placed the 3 pieces to the Triforce in these rooms for the future hero. This kind of reminds me of the Triforce hunt in the Wind Waker, although I feel Nintendo could have used this creative idea of a full-on dungeon to collect the Triforce pieces, instead of forcing you to sail the Great Sea and search for them. This would have made Wind Waker feel more complete, since I personally feel it's missing a dungeon or two. But let's get back on topic to number 4. Speaking of the Wind Waker, the Tower of the Gods is a really cool dungeon aesthetically. It reminds me of the Sheikah shrines in Breath of the Wild, which could possibly hint at that the Sheikah were also responsible for creating this tower. If you think about it, it's the only Wind Waker dungeon with water. Who knows if Great Fish Isle was planned to be the game's water dungeon, but the only time water is used in the game is in the beginning of the Tower of the Gods. But instead of controlling the water level like in Ocarina of Time's water temple, it escalates on its own. The second part of the dungeon is a climb to the boss. You'll learn the command melody, which is used in a really nice way to introduce the mechanic prior to the Earth and Wind temples, where you'll have to escort Medley and Makar with this specific melody. Getting a glimpse of the outside world around you while traversing inside a dungeon has always felt so refreshing, and the Tower of the Gods does this right before the boss. Sadly, you can't see any islands from up here, but it's still a super nice touch. Now, number 3. After completing the Water Temple, the Hero of Time travels to Kakariko Village as the ghost of Bongo Bongo begins to wreak havoc. This is where our hero discovers the Shadow Temple. However, at this point in the game, you have an option to either head west to take on the Spirit Temple, or enter Kakariko's graveyard. Either way, the Lens of Truth is required for both directions. And the Shadow Temple is the main route the game will push you towards since the Lens of Truth is located within Kakariko. Freshly off of the extremely non-linear Water Temple, the Shadow Temple is the complete opposite. It's a direct path to the boss, and the dungeon most likely won't stump you with puzzles. Instead, the real fear is with the enemies. Redeads, Dead Hand, Like-Likes, Floor and Wall Masters, Stolfos, Beamos, and even guillotines. The Shadow Temple is heavily theorized to be an ancient torture prison, and the eerie dungeon theme gives the temple an identity. One of my favorite things about Ocarina of Time isn't just how diverse its dungeons are, but how fitting each dungeon theme is. The drumbeat from Bongo Bongo isn't just unsettling, it gives him a restless vibe as if he's still lamenting over his past life. Now, on to my number 2 from Twilight Princess. Choosing a dungeon from this game was especially tough. We got the Arbiter's Grounds, which is almost as haunting as the Shadow Temple. The Temple of Time, almost as mysterious as the Lost Woods. The lead up to the Snowpeak ruins invented the awesome ideal of shield surfing. But my favorite dungeon from Twilight Princess is the City in the Sky. By this point in the game, you've explored most of Hyrule. That is, until you get shot out of a cannon into the sky. Sure, the this concept has already been used in the Minish Cap with the Palace of Winds, but the major difference atmosphere-wise is how ancient the City in the Sky feels. The Oka now dwell here, but this place just feels like there was previously something more. One unique thing about this dungeon is how interactive the boss is. He'll destroy your path forward, forcing you to obtain the double claw shot. Sure, some players may look at this as an annoyance, however it establishes build-up to the boss. It isn't just another monster waiting for you behind a locked door. You genuinely want to slay this dragon because it stopped you, the player, from progressing. Before I get to my number 1, let's quickly brush over some honorable mentions. The Earth Temple seems to be people's favorite from the Wind Waker, but I actually prefer the Wind Temple. This dungeon is enjoyable just to look at. I loved using the Deku leaf to soar around the main room. The Wind Temple is an excellent final dungeon to a beautiful game. And how could I not mention Stone Tower Temple? The entire build up to this dungeon with Ikana Castle is so awesome. When I first beat Majora's Mask, this was the only temple that forced me to race the moon. I remember fighting the boss with just seconds to spare. Beating Stone Tower on the final hours will always be a moment I'll remember when I think of this dungeon. And now it's time for my favorite dungeon in the entire series, the Water Temple. Sure, this place can be tedious as hell and full of backtracking, but if you look at this temple in its entirety, the complexity of this place is bar none. And that's why it's my favorite. If you say the Water Temple is your favorite dungeon, I will unsub from all my 62 accounts. You better not do not this. My actual number 1 is Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple. So when I was little, I used to run around on my older brother's file. I remember finding the Forest Temple and being creeped out just because of its theme. So naturally, years later when I returned to the game, I vaguely remembered certain rooms. Because of that, it felt like I was finally fulfilling an old quest from my childhood, which ties into Ocarina's overall theme of growing up, and how the curiosity of being a kid contrasts the seriousness of being an adult. The Forest Temple will always hold a special place in my gaming life. So that's my list. If your favorite dungeon wasn't mentioned, feel free to let me know. Condensing dungeons to just a top 5 means there'll be plenty of epic dungeons left over. Really appreciate you watching, homie, and as always, stay hype. Peace.